Anyway, this afternoon we're going to look at the question of materialism, and I'd like to start with a little quote from the Vishnu Purana about the Kali Yuga, the age of darkness which we currently find ourselves in. And it says, wealth and piety will decrease day by day until the world is wholly depraved. Then property alone will confer rank. Wealth will be the only source of devotion. Passion will be the sole bond of union between the sexes. Falsehood will be the only means of success in litigation. And women will be objects merely of sensual gratification. Earth will be venerated only for its mineral resources. Now that does sound very much like the world that we occupy at the moment. And as I wrote in my introduction to this talk, the material world is really the only world that a lot of people accept and understand. There is no world for many people beyond the physical senses. And of course, we know how limiting and limited the physical senses can be. We know that our eyesight is far less powerful than many animals. We know that our sense of smell and sense of touch and sense of hearing is very inferior to other species in the animal kingdom. And yet we rely on these senses almost exclusively. We've all heard this phrase, haven't we? Seeing is believing. And yet the irony here, of course, is that even modern science understands that we can only see a tiny sliver of the universe, and the rest is described as dark energy or dark matter. And therefore, you know, to just talk simply about what we can see, and we can see a tiny fragment, a tiny little bit of the full electromagnetic spectrum. And so materialism really dominates everything in our world. It dominates our perception, as I've just said, and therefore it dominates also our consciousness, because everything is just looked at in terms of the physical objects. And yet science tells us that, you know, there are no physical objects really. It's we understand that what we call atoms are largely empty space. And that our understanding of matter is actually extremely limited. And if materialism dominates our consciousness, and if it dominates our perception, it also dominates our behavior, because many people are just motivated by the material things in the world. We assess people on the basis of what they have, what they own, rather than who they are and higher values. And materialism tends to squeeze out these higher notions that we once enjoyed in the past, notions of truth and beauty and goodness and concepts like this. These are completely squeezed out largely by materialism. And we live in a world where people all want to emulate rich people. We all want to be billionaires. Well, I personally don't want to be a billionaire because I feel actually quite sorry for them, because billionaires are extremely unhappy people. Why? Because however many billions they have, however much they own, there's always somebody who owns more than they do, and therefore they feel jealous. So we've reached a point where materialism is so much in the ascendancy, it's so dominant, it's so overriding, that it blots out many other things that we understand. Madame Blavatsky talked a lot about materialism back in the 19th century, and yet the world then was far less material than it is now. And so what she was writing then really didn't reflect this dominance that materialism has come to assume during the 20th and now the 21st century. Materialism also creates a false morality. I mean, morality is one of those words that people very rarely use these days. It's one of those quaint, old-fashioned terms which seem somehow to belong to another era. And yet, morality is something that the world desperately needs at the moment. Our whole moral platform seems to be deeply skewed. And this is because materialistic views of the world, our consciousness and behavior, is motivated by what we have. It's motivated by greed and selfishness. And it's motivated by our constant need to have more than we actually need to survive as people. And yet this is a comparatively new phenomenon. We all live in the material world, and there's no escaping from that. But the problem with materialism is that it denies all other realities, and it denies other subtle realms of existence. And therefore, it's a kind of suffocation. It's a distorting and blinding force, which really makes us very blind and unable to see other things. Now, we can't escape materialism, clearly. We can't escape the material world that we're in, because we're all undergoing a physical experience as souls. We're souls in a material body at the moment. We can't escape that. But what we can do is to reassess our attitudes to these things. And it struck me that it's quite interesting that this is quite a modern, a relatively modern phenomenon, materialism. It probably starts somewhere around the 17th century with the rise of the age of so-called Enlightenment and rationalism, the philosophy of René Descartes, and similar things. And there's a very interesting quote here from Rupert Sheldrake, the biologist. And he says, the desacralization of the natural world was taken to its ultimate conclusion in the 17th century. Through the mechanistic revolution, the old model of the living cosmos was replaced by the idea of the universe as a machine. According to this new theory of the world, nature no longer had a life of her own. She was soulless, devoid of all spontaneity, freedom, and creativity. Mother Nature was no more than dead matter, moving in unfailing obedience to God-given mathematical laws. And this is really where we're at the moment. Many people, despite discoveries of quantum physics and other things, still regard the universe as like this clockwork machine, which behaves in a particular way. And yet, many indigenous peoples around the world who cling on to old spiritual beliefs, the people of the past, regarded the earth as a living, breathing entity, something that was actually alive, something in which we as human beings were part of that living entity. And this is the view I think many people in theosophy and spiritual traditions still held on to. The first challenges to this idea, apart from obviously things like theosophy, came probably 50 years ago when people like Lyle Watson wrote his book Supernature, and this idea that everything is connected and everything is alive. The independent scientist James Lovelock, who died a couple of weeks ago, he was one of the first people to propound this idea that the earth was a living, breathing entity, although he was forced to step back to some extent from his views because of pressure from his contemporaries and his peers and the scientific establishment. And Eddie, who's with us today, in his fantastic new book, Unfolding Consciousness, which we're going to be reviewing in the next issue of Esoterica talks a lot about this, about how science is completely dominated to a huge degree by materialistic paradigms, and how notions of consciousness are dominated by this. The scientific view, or as Eddie calls it, scientism, which in itself has become its own religion of sorts, says that consciousness can't exist without form. So therefore, we need a brain in order to produce consciousness. And many of us would accept the view that rather than being a storehouse of consciousness or ideas or memories or whatever, the brain is a receiver which can be tuned in to receive perceptions, information, etc., from sources beyond itself. But still, this is very much a minority view, although I think it's a view which is changing. And I think we're going to see in the next generation or so a huge shift in the way that people regard this. At the moment, it's still very much a minority view. And people say, well, how can you have consciousness unless there's a brain there to produce it in some way? But this is a hugely myopic view of how things basically operate. And of course, the materialistic view dominates something which I personally have done a lot of research into, and which is something that I do a lot of talks on, which is the notions of death and the afterlife and reincarnation. And although a lot more people these days believe in notions of rebirth and reincarnation, it's still looked on by many people as a rather quirky idea. They say, well, how can consciousness continue after death when there is no physical apparatus in which to focus that consciousness, in which to process it? And therefore, people just have this view that the universe is a place which happened by accident, and we are just accidental occupants of this universe. There is no wider purpose. There is no coherence to it. It's all just a series of random accidents which we happen to find ourselves in. And this is a hugely, hugely dangerous attitude. And I think it's largely led to creating the world that we have at the moment, which is a very problematic, a very troubled world, and a world where our perceptions are so narrow and so limited. And to see things just in terms of a material view is always going to be this very constricting idea. And it holds us back from our natural psycho-spiritual evolution, of which we as theosophists and people of similar traditions, which we put a very high price on. We know that this is ultimately our purpose for being here. And in a material world, there is no greater purpose. It's just here. There are objects. We're here to get as much money as we can and then die and face some kind of oblivion. So this revolution I'm talking about, it's not going to be easy because it's so embedded in the human mind and it's so reinforced by science. And I think the acme of all this is our modern obsession with technology. I'm not against technology. There are many useful things that we all use, like Zoom this afternoon, which are incredibly useful in bringing people together and doing all sorts of other things. But our reliance on technology is, I think, becoming extremely, extremely dangerous. You can't walk down any street in the world today. You can't go to any place where there aren't people just welded to a smartphone. I went to a concert last week in Athens in the Odeon, the amphitheater created by the Romans on the Acropolis. We went to see a concert by Mozart. Beautiful, beautiful music. During that concert, at least half the 5,000 people who were sitting there are just sitting there on their phones, playing games, not listening to the music, actually just there on their phones all the time. So this technology is actually starting to become an impediment, especially as regards human freedoms, and the fact that we're creating all sorts of means and methods of surveillance, monitoring people, and all the rest of it. And these technologies are actually becoming quite dangerous. There's a lot of talk, isn't there, about things like artificial intelligence. I was reading a report this week, which was produced by, of all people, Google and people from Oxford University, saying that artificial intelligence could actually be the most dangerous threat to the human race, worse than any kind of climate change, war, nuclear weapons, and all the rest of it, because we have the ability to create machines without any kind of moral compass who could destroy us. There seems to be this strange obsession on the part of a lot of people about things like transhumanism, as if it's somehow a good idea that we are welded to machines and we have electronic and other components as part of ourselves. So to say that we can solve the problems that we've created by technology using that technology, to me, is an absurdity. And it's something that we need to deeply think about. And there are people who enthusiastically embrace all this stuff all the time. They talk very much about how it'll be wonderful when we can increase our intelligence by implanting things in our brains and chips and all sorts of other things. And I can think of nothing more horrifying. It makes a lot of those things that George Orwell and Aldous Huxley and all the other science fiction writers, the things that they wrote about, it makes them look pale in comparison to the horrible potential that we face. And artificial intelligence and transhumanism are the ultimate manifestations in many ways of this materialistic paradigm, which squeezes out all other alternatives. If we just believe in a material universe, we are effectively shutting out more than 99% of all other realities, because we ignore the fact, which we know as theosophists and spiritual people exist. We know that there are subtle realms. We know there are etheric realms, astral realms, mental realms, the realms of wisdom, intuition, the realms of spirit, and realms that we're not even aware of. It means also that not only do we deny the existence of these subtle realities, these non-physical realities, we actually deride them. We look on them as primitive superstition by our supposed primitive ancestors who didn't know any better but to believe in magic and subtle worlds. It also means that we deny subtle forces. We deny types of energy which we talk about in theosophy, things like prana, which keeps us alive, coming from the sun and being transmitted to us through invisible kingdoms of nature, through nature spirits and through devas. We shut ourselves off to all these things because we think, well, this is at odds with what science tells us. This is at odds with what the mainstream view is at the moment, and therefore it can't be right. The people of the past were just ignorant savages who believed these things because they didn't know any better. And yet they were wiser than we are because they were able to operate in conjunction and in a compassionate and creative relationship with the invisible forces of nature in a way that we can't anymore. We believe ourselves to be so sophisticated and that we've created all these technologies, and yet we have lost touch completely, not only with the natural world, but de facto ourselves as well. We have become completely divorced from the wider universe. We might be able to probe the smallest aspects of matter more effectively than in the past with our advanced microscopes and other instruments. We might have things like the James Webb telescope, which enables us to peer into parts of the universe we were never able to see before. But it doesn't actually change our understanding of anything, because we are still shackled to this exclusively materialistic view of the world. And this is why I call this talk The Myths of Materialism, because materialism has created its own strange and weird and distorted mythology. It's created a perception of the world which is supposedly unassailable, and yet which we know is fundamentally flawed because it excludes so many different things. So science has become very arrogant and hubristic. I'm not against science, not against science at all. Madame Blavatsky said on more than one occasion that science was theosophy's best ally. And I think this is absolutely true, and I think it's absolutely the case. But it's not as long as it goes down this narrow tunnel and refuses to see anything else. In his book, Eddie talks about, very interestingly, about how people with different perspectives on life and on science and on all sorts of other things are usually persecuted and derided and often killed. And he comes up with a long, long list of people who have had ideas far ahead of their time and who have suffered greatly because of that. We know that Madame Blavatsky suffered greatly because she was coming out with ideas back in the late 19th century, which, although very ancient and part of a timeless wisdom and a perennial philosophy, had become lost during the Victorian era and the rise of the Industrial Revolution, of science, of technology. And there was this view in her time, a view which still persists today, that we can somehow conquer nature as if it's somehow our enemy. And only a materialistic point of view would ever conceive of such a crazy notion as that. The idea that we can conquer and dominate and control the very continuum of which we are an integral part. This, to me, is just the worst kind of thinking that you can possibly have. And so we need to open ourselves up to these wider worlds. Our ancestors were aware of the creatures and the entities which occupied the astral and mental realms and the etheric realms, the nature spirits who are the builders in these realms, and then the angelic presences, or as we call them, devas, who operate on the mental planes. Our ancestors communed with these entities. We completely deny that they exist at all. And if you start to talk to people about this, they do think you're mad and in need of urgent psychiatric treatment. And yet our ancestors cooperated with these entities. They knew they were there. They knew they played a vital part in the growing of crops and in everything which we need to support ourselves in this physical world. But we've come so far from that now that I think it will be very, very difficult to persuade any large numbers of people that these entities exist. I did a talk some time ago on this, and it's something which Theosophy talks an awful lot about, and other people talk about as well, and yet it's not something that we as an organization discuss very much, and I think we should do. I think we should be able to understand how the world is created. People like Geoffrey Hodgson, who was a prominent theosophist and also a clairvoyant, he wrote some very interesting material almost 100 years ago now, about how the devas and the nature spirits play a crucial and central role in how a child is formed, fetus and an embryo in the mother's womb, and how different stages unfold during the course of pregnancy, and how other entities all play their role in creating a fresh human life. It's interesting to explore those people who've written about, who are able to perceive these entities, like Hodgson and other people, and there are certainly not many people who are able to perceive these in a direct way, and yet we all can. We can't actually see these fairies dancing around at the bottom of our gardens necessarily, but we can often feel their presence. We can feel the presence of something beyond ourselves. But in order to do that, we have to dispense with this idea that we live in a purely material place with nothing else involved in it. So how do we go about trying to persuade people that this is something, that there is more to the world than just the atoms and the physical parts to it? Theosophy talks about other worlds made up of things other than physical matter. They talk about worlds made up of astral matter, mental matter, Buddhic matter. And yet this is very, very hard for people to understand. But I suspect that we are reaching a point very soon, probably not in my lifetime, but certainly during this century, assuming we don't destroy ourselves in some crazy war or in some other way, where these ideas are going to take shape in a much more important and positive and realistic way. It strikes me that this overriding materialistic paradigm in which we find ourselves, and which I alluded to at the start of the talk in terms of this age of darkness which we live in at the moment, these are the symptoms of that age, where we had a golden age where we were much more attuned to nature and to the natural world and to the other entities, and we walked amongst gods and the gods walked amongst us. And then gradually over time we went through a silver age, a bronze age, and now we are somewhere in this dark end of the cycle where everything else gets squeezed out. So those of us who consider these things, those of us who think about these finer, more subtle worlds and know that there is something beyond this, we are part of an important vanguard. In some ways, I know it's not a popular word to use these days, but we are part of an elite who can see reality beyond the end of our noses and who can see that there are vistas which we can open up to ourselves if we choose to do so. We know there are wider worlds out there, and we know that we only have a tiny fraction of the truth at the moment. But I remain quite optimistic about this, because I do think, despite all the outward appearances, despite all the terrible things going on in the world at the moment, a spiritual revolution has been taking place slowly, behind the scenes, unobtrusively, and people's attitudes have changed dramatically over the last 100 years. And I think Theosophy has played a tremendously important part in this, in making these wonderful ideas from the perennial philosophy or ageless wisdom or whatever we call it, more available to people in a way that they haven't been for hundreds of years before Madame Blavatsky and others came along and opened this tiny corner of the veil, as she called it, and let these secrets out of the box again. And what strikes me as being very interesting is that although Theosophy has never evangelized about these things, it's never stood on a soapbox in the high street and said, you've got to believe these things, there's a much wider world open here. although it's never evangelized about these things and it's never even tried to publicize them in any mass way, so many of the ideas about subtle realms, about consciousness, about other worlds have slowly slipped into public consciousness. I wrote an article a couple of years ago for the Theosophist magazine called The Infiltration Game. And this was about how these ideas, such as there is no dead matter or empty space, that everything is connected, that everything is conscious, and that we are all part of an evolving continuum of life. There is nothing but life. These ideas have gradually and in a major way slipped into a much wider groupthink of the world. And I'm mystified, really, in many ways, to know how this has happened, when theosophy has never been more than important as it is. It's never been supported by millions and millions of people. And it just shows you how, when ideas whose time has come, when they arrive and when we explore them, it shows how these things slip into consciousness, whether we like it or not. If you take as an example people's belief in rebirth, in ideas of an afterlife, in terms of reincarnating again and again and again as part of some sort of evolutionary process. This has changed enormously even during my lifetime. At the end of the Second World War, if you'd talk to people about reincarnation and rebirth in the West, where the dominant religions of Christianity, for example, completely deny this, very, very few people would have accepted it. Now, when they do surveys, when they ask people what they believe about these things in the West and in Europe and in the westernized countries, up to a third of people, between a quarter and a third of people now accept that there is some form of rebirth which takes place. Now, for that to happen in the space of 2 generations is absolutely astonishing. And that's why I'm hopeful, because these ideas, as alien as they are at the moment, about materialism being the only reality, it is changing. People are beginning to reform their views about this, and people are not just embracing different religions and spiritual traditions, they are beginning to see these things for themselves. But there's a long, hard road ahead. There is a great journey to go on to get people away from this idea that the only world is the physical one. And I think this is going to have huge impacts, not just upon the way we regard science and technology, not just the way that it shapes our consciousness and perception and behavior and morality. It's also going to have other practical benefits. When we look now at how they used to treat disease, say 100 or 200 years ago, by bloodletting, by putting leeches on people, and all sorts of other horrible practices, 100 years from now, when we look back at the 20th and 21st century and see how we treat diseases with really, really nasty drugs sometimes and surgery, we will say this was barbaric. How could people have possibly contemplated this? Because we know there is a strong emerging tradition, and this is not necessarily that new. I'm talking about things like homeopathy, which is a red rag to a bull when it comes to many doctors. They'll say, how can something that is more diluted than the Pacific Ocean, when there's one particle in trillions and trillions and trillions, how can that have an effect on the physical body? Because they don't realize there are other realms. Homeopathy works on a different plane of existence. It works on the etheric. Modern medical science doesn't understand the cause of disease. It doesn't understand that it starts in the subtle realms, the mental realms, the astral realms, and then makes itself known through the etheric and finally appears in the physical. So we will develop much more subtle forms of energetic medicine. These things have existed for some time, but medical science has been against them. The other day I was reading about the work of Wilhelm Reich, who explored something called orgone energy. Now, orgone energy is just another word for a vital force which appears in so many different cultures. We call it prana. In the East, they call it chi. In various other cultures, they have different names for it, but they know there is this finer force. And it is this finer force which we can use to help cure disease. I mean, the other thing is, of course, that much disease is karmic. It occurs because of our thoughts, words, and deeds in previous life, and that's transmitted to us in our present incarnation. And therefore, going beyond the physical realms will create a revolution in all areas of human endeavor, and not least the medical one. It will also revolutionize other parts of medicine, psychology. When we know, for example, that the world and we ourselves are affected by these things we call the seven rays, when we know that each person is made up of a combination of these rays, we will develop a different form of psychology. We'll be able to read people's ray structures. We'll be able to say, well, this person has an aptitude for this, this person has a weakness and a deficiency in this particular area. But by understanding people's ray makeup, by understanding perhaps their karmic obligations, we will get a much better view of people than we do at the moment, because psychology and psychiatry are still comparatively crude sciences. They still rely heavily on drugs. I know we have a lot of talking therapies, and I know that doctors admit that there is such a thing as psychosomatic illness, but they don't understand it in any truly meaningful way. It's just, it seems to me they just pay lip service to this. And to understand the power of consciousness to heal ourselves and to heal others without sticking people on operating tables and without trying to cure disease in the most crude and basic ways, this will be part of this forthcoming revolution, the post-materialistic age. But before we can get into this age, before we can move out of the prisons of materialism, because that's exactly what they are. You know, we've all heard the story of Plato's cave, where the people trapped in the cellar mistake the shadows for reality. And this is precisely what we do in our materialistic assessment of the world and our exclusively materialistic assessment of the world. So I repeat, I'm optimistic about the fact that we can overcome this prison. We can actually break down the doors of it and start to escape from it. And I think that what we do, what people in theosophy and in similar lines of work are doing, is so important at the moment. It's so important to create an alternative superstructure, a set of ideas, a new knowledge base, which enables us to go beyond these areas that we have come to accept are the only reality. So I'm going to park it up there. I've probably spoken for too long, but what I would very much appreciate is if we could just talk about some of these things, because you might profoundly disagree with what I say, and indeed, in some ways, I hope you do, because you know, this is the way we move forward, by exchanging these views. And if this ever goes up onto YouTube, and if they do decide to cancel us again for coming out with dissident views of the world, then that's down to them. But YouTube, if you're listening, if your algorithmic machines are listening to what we have to say, then please cancel us, but you won't stop the message that there is more to life than the material world. Thank you very much for listening.